Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With a ceasefire and a prisoner release, or without, what changes in the war on Gaza, and what doesn't? Let's get to the bottom line. With a deal between Hamas and Israel for a temporary ceasefire, or without one, it's obvious that we're seeing a new phase in Israel's war on Gaza. But the big questions remain. How far will Israel's operation go? Is it winning hearts and minds, or destroying them? What are the implications for America, Israel's closest ally, as nations around the world protest Israel's operation, which is so deadly to innocents, particularly children? How about the implications for Joe Biden, whose popularity among Democrats is in rapid decline, as younger voters are saying they can't support Israel's actions in Gaza? And really, just what happens next? Today, we're talking with former CIA Director General David Petraeus, who's also served as commander of U.S. Central Command and led U.S. forces in both Afghanistan and Iraq. His latest book is Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, and it just came out last month. General Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us, and sorry for the froggy throat. There is a deal on a hostage exchange for about 150 Palestinian held in Israeli jails may be released for 50 hostages, particularly elderly and children, that Hamas has taken after its October 7th attack. I'm interested in your reaction in this moment, but I'm also interested in the big picture. When it comes to the broad side of Israel achieving its objectives, does this help, or is it irrelevant to those objectives?
Well, I think it helps because one of the objectives is to gain release of the hostages. So clearly, a partial return of a significant number of the hostages is positive in terms of meeting that particular objective. But of course, it also allows Hamas a bit of a breather. Hamas is, if you will, a fighter on the ropes to some degree. And when you're on the ropes, what you seek is a pause in the action. You seek a breather. It gives them an opportunity because this will stretch out for a number of days. My understanding is that, there will be, say, 10 or so of the hostages released a day. There will be a 6-hour window during which no drones will fly over Gaza. So presumably that will limit the ability of the Israelis to figure out where the hostages are coming from, what Hamas fighters might be doing to facilitate this, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to provide a 5 or more day period during which Hamas can reorganize, regroup, can redistribute ammunition and supplies and so forth. And as I said, get a bit of a breather from what has been a pretty intense offensive so far in northern Gaza, at least.
We've seen a lot of international reaction, a lot of reaction within the United States, the global South, to what they see as indiscriminate bombing and raiding and killing. Now, the staggering number of innocents that have been killed is something that is getting a lot of reaction. So what would you advise for the next phase?
Well, first, I should just note that I do tend to agree that Hamas has revealed itself to be an extremist army that is therefore irreconcilable. The analogy with the Islamic State is flawed. There is obviously an element of Palestinian nationalism that is present with Hamas that is different from what the Islamic State stood for. But at the end of the day, they are both similar in that they are seen by their enemy as being irreconcilable. And when we were doing the surge in Iraq, for example, we went to enormous lengths to determine with our intelligence assets who are the reconcilable elements, and we try to strip them away from the Sunni insurgents, the Iranian-supported Shia militia, and who are the irreconcilable elements, those that have to be captured or killed if they refuse to be detained. And I think at Hamas, through these horrible atrocities, this barbaric action that they took, even filming it so the whole world could see the extent of the unspeakable actions that they did take, that they have put themselves in the camp of irreconcilables, and therefore they have to be, as Israel has identified, destroyed. And as a military task, that means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his objective without reconstitution. Keep an eye on that task without reconstitution, because I think it's one of the big questions that looms out there, in addition to some others that I want to identify. Israel's also said about dismantling the political wing of Hamas, so it's going to take down, if you will, the government of Gaza, as well as the extremist elements that visited these barbaric acts on largely innocent Israeli civilians. So if that's the objective, then they've got to resume the operation. And one of the questions that the IDF should answer, a vision that they should provide, is what will life be like for Palestinians in Gaza after Hamas has been destroyed and the political wing has been dismantled? And then actually show that by clearing and holding areas and then beginning to rebuild them, so that you are not just handing out humanitarian assistance, which they should definitely do. Again, hearts and minds really do matter here. And you should restore basic services, begin reconstruction of the enormous amount of damage and destruction, a lot of which just is unavoidable, by the way, Steve. Again, as is tragically loss of innocent civilian life, but obviously have to keep that to an absolute minimum. Israel claims that they are. I think they have to continue to examine that very, very closely. We had a sign on the wall of the operations centers when I was privileged to command in Iraq and Afghanistan, 5 combat commands in total, as you'll recall. And that sign asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And if the answer to that was no, in other words, it's going to create more bad guys than it takes off the street because you do it, then you're supposed to examine how it is that you reduce the risk of that. And if you can't, then you actually have to figure out how you're going to accomplish your objective some other way. I think that's a good process. It's a good question to answer. This is why it was staring me in the face in all of these different ops centers over the years. And I think that question does beg, again, an answer literally every time that you're looking at conducting an operation. Now, another facet here is also, of course, ultimately, who is going to both administer Gaza and who's going to secure it. And the security component is important because that's how you ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. And I think that is a very, very big question as well. Now, to be fair, everyone is working on this issue of who can administer Gaza, who can, in a sense, govern it, and then who can provide security for it, as they're also reestablishing basic services and overseeing reconstruction. But the sooner that question is answered, the better, because a military commander needs what's called the desired end state. What is it we are seeking to accomplish here beyond the destruction of Hamas and dismantlement of the political wing? There are several key questions that have to be answered. And until they are answered, you really can't go about the military campaign with quite the vision that you would have if you had some sense of that. And I'll just end by noting that, for example, there's got to be real concern about the Palestinian people in Gaza. You cannot, eventually, Israel's going to have to go south. Are they just going to push them around again? That's not the right answer. What it should be is to allow them to return to their homes or dwellings, or if necessary, refugee camps in the north, given the damage and destruction and the way that so many of these structures have been made uninhabitable, but control that security. And you have to have population control, just as we did in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in these other cities, as we cleared, held, and then went further. But we were rebuilding immediately as we proceeded so that the civilians could come back into them. We could restore their basic services and begin reconstruction.
So, General, who has to be involved in this process for that to work? Who has to become the defender of the Palestinian side if they have lost so many in this incursion, this strike by the Israelis after the Hamas attack? How can they have trust or faith in what has just happened to them, that there is a better horizon?
Well, again, I think there has to be a vision. It starts with a vision. This is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is what it will mean for you, that life will be better, and then lay out how that will happen, and then set about making it happen. Who's going to be the ultimate defender? It may be the Israeli Defense Forces, because, again, I don't see hands going up in the region. You may. I've actually talked to a number of old comrades from the Gulf states, official in Egypt and elsewhere. There are no hands going up that are volunteering to be the force on the ground, nor even the interim administration or what have you, some kind of transitional authority. And there's a variety of plans that have been mooted. None of those strike me as particularly realistic, including certainly, ideally, there would be a competent, capable, integrity, all the rest of this kind of government that would come over from the West Bank, Palestinian Authority. But I don't see a competent, capable, trustworthy entity that is going to come over. And they certainly don't want to be seen as coming in on the backs of Israeli tanks. So how is this going to be cobbled together? And my fear is that it probably is going to be the Israeli Defense Forces for an interim period at the very least, while others are trying to pursue the diplomacy and the other initiatives that can enable some kind of transitional authority, but it has to be given real authority. And again, can the Israelis trust this interim authority to ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute? I tend to doubt it. And if that's the case, then what happens when Hamas does reconstitute and you have another one of these atrocities such as 10/7? Well, so again, this is why I think that vision, the sooner the better, noting that, yes, there's going to be criticism if Israel is seen to be reoccupying Gaza. But again, tell me the alternative.
But it raises another interesting fundamental question. When you sort of look at essentially the day after, if we get to a day after, and a day after, I should say, as you've said, can be 9 months or longer. Mosul was 9 months. So we can see this horror for a very long time.
Yep. And Israel is much more capable, I think. But again, it will be months, not weeks.
Right. And so in that situation, I guess I asked what the implications are for the United States and President Biden, who's been trying to get humanitarian assistance in and had a lot of rough time getting a pretty minimal amount of humanitarian assistance in. What is the state of U.S. power and leverage right now from your perspective? Joe Biden wants a two-state solution, sees this as the earthquake of earthquakes that could possibly get us there. I'm wondering, is this just another conflict on a long line of conflicts where it eventually fades away and we really have nothing underneath this that changes?
I think the Israelis are determined that not be the case. Now, the problem is obviously the domestic politics in Israel, and all of that is somewhat on hold, Steve, for the time being. Clearly, the focus is on proceeding with the military operation. I don't think you can expect the opposition even to call for it. They can call for an eventual change in government. But I think that now that you have a coalition government to a degree, or a government of a degree of national unity, that they're going to proceed with this war, hold off on the postmortems, the investigations, and all the rest of that for at least a period of time until you see the objectives being much more close to being met. But of course, that could stretch out, and then the impatience could begin. There's pressure, of course, on the United States front. There's pressure elsewhere in the world. And there's another. Remember, Steve, I used to talk about you had the Baghdad clock and you had the Washington clock. And the Washington clock was always going very rapidly. And the Baghdad clock, you'd sort of tap it every now and then to ensure that it's still moving, because the progress at certain times was quite slow until we got it going, frankly, about 4 or 5 months into the surge. But there's another clock here. That's the Israeli economic clock. How long can you keep 8% of your workforce in uniform without an impact on the economy? And again, that depends on a number of different factors, needless to say, including how much aid will come from the outside. But that gives leverage to those countries that will engage in that as well. So, I mean, this is a very multidimensional endeavor that's ongoing. The U.S. Secretary of State obviously is shuttling around trying to bring various pieces of this together to see what might be possible in terms of an interim transitional authority. The Israelis there's at least 2 different groupings in their government that are working away on these issues. The problem is that they're very, very hard, and I'm not sure there's going to be the kind of resolution that folks would like to see. And therefore, you're going to end up with something less than optimal, because the optimal may not be possible. It certainly, I don't think, is possible that we'll see a competent, capable, and trustworthy Palestinian entity at the head of this coming over from the Palestinian Authority.
Let me ask you a question about Palestinian leadership, because we see the PA as weak, and we see a lot of the structural problems in leadership. But what would you be advising? We got the top competent Palestinian crowd involved and say, what should they be doing right now?
Well, this is a tough one because there are, as you noted, very competent and capable individuals. I used to deal with the prime minister in Ramallah in my final government position, who was exceedingly competent, but eventually got undermined, was sort of pushed to the side, and really hasn't played a significant role since then. Again, I'd love to see him.
Is this Salam Fayyad or a different?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and he's written recently about an end plan and in a foreign affairs article, and trying to put ideas on the table at least.
The challenge is, how do you empower him? Can he put a team together? Can it have authority? Where would the resources and authorities come from? Because obviously there's a lot of disagreement within the Palestinian Authority, within Fatah, and so forth. So in each case, there needs to be serious political reform, but there are entrenched interests that have opposed that quite firmly. And frankly, I'm not sure in all cases that those in Jerusalem were that eager to see that change. So again, there's a lot of factors at play here. It would be wonderful to see one of the really competent and capable and trustworthy leaders return from internal exile, or however you want to term it, or from external. There's some others in Gulf states and so forth that have been discussed. I just don't know whether they can build a team, whether they can be empowered, what the process would be. How do you get the authorities? From whom would the authorities be provided? Would this be a United Nations entity? Noting that there's going to have to be a lot of reform to the UN organization that oversees assistance here as well, given the diversions of the materials that have been provided that clearly took place. You know, you don't build 300 miles of reinforced concrete tunnels with scraps here and there. So this takes a real overhaul. And of course, that's why, as I mentioned, these are really hard issues. And it's not surprising that they haven't resolved them until this point in time. The problem is that at a certain point, you have to acknowledge that you may have to go with the undesirable solution, which is Israel administering this area. And if that's the case, again, then begin thinking that through with all the attendant actions that you should be taken to ensure a better life for the Palestinians as quickly as you possibly can, to convince them that you mean it. But again, there should be a vision for that. And by the way, not just for Gaza, but also for the West Bank. My hope, Steve, you asked, will this opportunity, is this a tragedy that has an opportunity? Can it be a catalyst that really does shake up the situation and result in some serious attention to longstanding issues when it comes to the situation between Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as in Gaza?
There's another side to this where there are a lot of Americans who are saying, we get nothing from being engaged around the world. You know, what ends up happening, we get drawn in to drama and conflict and costs that don't help us middle-class Americans. And I'm just interested to know to what degree you see this as a trigger politically in America and what your concerns are. And I also worry, frankly, about rising isolationism in America.
I think it's incumbent on all leaders to very clearly explain that what we do around the world is not for charitable reasons. It's because it's in our national interest and in the interest of our allies and partners who work with us to maintain this so-called rules-based international order that we helped bring into existence in the wake of a 50-year period that included 2 horrible world wars and the Great Depression. And for all of the imperfections of this order, and there are plenty, but for all of the shortcomings, this is done reasonably well for the world, and I would submit for the United States and, again, our allies and partners. So again, we're not members of NATO because we have charitable instincts or interests here. we're members of NATO and other alliances and partnerships and groupings because it is very much in our national interest, and not just in our national security interest, but in the interest of our national prosperity as well. I believe that the U.S. is, this indispensable power that Madeleine Albright used to describe. I know that term has been challenged at various points, but I think that it is accurate in that without U.S. leadership in the world, without us keeping all these different plates spinning, and I would submit that there are more plates, more challenges and threats and so forth, and more complex challenges and threats than at any time since the end of World War II. So our leadership is crucial. I think we have done an impressive job in responding to the brutal and unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine, albeit with some decisions that took longer than they should have. But again, we've kept NATO together. We've kept Putin from driving a wedge between Europe and North America. We've ensured that the response is very robust, $44 billion of U.S. alone, with Europe now actually more than that when it comes to security pledges, in addition to vastly more that they've provided in financial, economic, and humanitarian assistance, leading the way with the effort in financial, economic, and personal sanctions on Russia and export controls, now going after the sanctions evaders. All of this, the U.S. has done, I think, very impressively, noting again that I felt that there were some decisions that could have been made more rapidly and that caused some challenges for Ukraine during the summer offensive. But we have to remember, and one of the lessons out of the book that Andrew Roberts and I just published, is that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in another. And if we show that we're not a steadfast ally for Israel, that will have ramifications out in the Indo-Pacific. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, the decision to withdraw by two administrations, and then the way it was conducted, President Xi seized on that and say, see, you can't depend on the Americans. They're not reliable allies. And look how it went. They're clearly a great power in decline. And again, the eyes of the world are on us. When I was in Kyiv 5 weeks or 6 weeks ago, they were more seized with what was going on in our House of Representatives than most Americans were, and in part because their survival can depend to some degree on that. But again, we have to convince Americans, we who believe, I guess, that America should be a world leader, the world leader, really, when it comes to the Western world, and that the reason we do it is for our national interest in security terms and also in terms of our national prosperity.
With that, I want to thank General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA, former commander of CENTCOM. Congratulations on the book, which I highly recommend to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Steve. Once again, always a pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? It matters how Israel conducts itself in this war. How are Palestinians supposed to accept Israel as a steward of Gaza the day after the fighting stops? If Israel wants to achieve any of its aims, it's going to have to figure out solutions that lead to the empowerment of Palestine, not the ongoing defenestration of its citizens. The problem I see is that the Israel we see today has launched nothing visible that shows a sensitivity towards innocents who are dying by the thousands, nor pre-positioning a discussion within Israel or with the Arab world or the West and the Palestinians themselves on what a future political horizon for Palestine can be. Some prisoners may be set free, and that's great, but it's just not enough. This is a substantial crisis whose shock waves are going to reverberate for years. And that's the bottom line.